The Nexarion Defense Institute, perched on the crystalline cliffs of Veltharion Prime like a monument to galactic superiority, its bioluminescent spires reaching toward the heavens, with a sort of architectural arrogance that screamed, "We're better than you, and our buildings prove it." For 5 millennia, the Institute had served as the galaxy's premier finishing school for the offspring of advanced civilizations, transforming pampered alien aristocrats into the sort of military officers who could lose wars with style and proper pronunciation. The admissions brochure, printed on organic matter that cost more than most planets' annual budgets, boasted about their diverse student body and inclusive excellence standards. This was bureaucratic doublespeak for, "We'll admit exactly one representative from each species rich enough to afford our tuition, provided they meet our strict definitions of evolutionary sophistication." Walking through the Institute's main promenade on any given day was like touring a xenobiologist's fevered dream, creatures of impossible beauty and complexity, gliding past with the casual confidence that came from never doubting their place at the apex of galactic civilization. The Catherians dominated the social hierarchy through sheer luminous magnificence, their energy-based physiology allowing them to manipulate electromagnetic fields like lesser species handled crude matter. They moved like living auroras, plasma cascading across their translucent forms in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Their very existence was a constant reminder that some species had evolved beyond the messy biological processes that plagued more primitive life forms. The Morvac collective minds floated through the corridors in their environmental pods, hundreds of individual organisms functioning as a single superintelligent entity. Their thought processes operated on quantum levels that made conventional computers look like counting on fingers, and they approached every problem with the sort of analytical perfection that came from having 17 different consciousness types working in parallel. Conversation with a Morvac was less like talking to a person and more like consulting a living supercomputer that occasionally condescended to explain things in terms lesser minds could grasp. At the bottom of the evolutionary ladder, the Gorax provided the Institute's muscle and comic relief. These silicon-based titans stood 3 meters tall and massed enough to qualify as geological features, their crystalline hide capable of shrugging off weapon strikes that would vaporize more delicate species. They weren't stupid, exactly, but their idea of tactical subtlety involved hitting things slightly less hard than usual. Most civilizations used them as living siege engines, which suited the Gorax perfectly since thinking was hard and breaking things was fun. And then there were the humans, all one of them. Cadet Jaxon Kruger stood at the awkward intersection of too tall for civilized species and embarrassingly short by Gorax standards, his carbon-based biology marking him as a primitive relic from the galaxy's less enlightened past. His admission to the Institute had been part of the Experimental Integration Protocol, a diplomatic initiative designed to prove the galaxy's commitment to helping backward species achieve their modest potential. The fact that humans had only discovered faster than light travel 50 years ago made them the academic equivalent of charity cases, included more for their novelty value than any actual expectation of success. Jaxon possessed the sort of unremarkable features that most species found either boring or vaguely threatening, depending on their own evolutionary baggage. His binocular vision setup suggested a predatory background that made herbivorous species nervous, while his flexible facial expressions struck more sophisticated beings as primitive emotional displays. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned early that wasted motion could mean death, a trait that his instructors attributed to inferior motor control rather than survival instincts honed on a world that actively tried to kill its inhabitants. The Institute's hazing traditions had been refined over centuries to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to proper military specifications. What they called character development involved systematic psychological and physical abuse designed to weed out the weak and indoctrinate the survivors into the Institute's vision of galactic military excellence. The process had a mortality rate that would have shocked civilized worlds, but the Institute's lawyers had crafted liability waivers that turned accidental death into learning opportunities and character-building experiences. For most species, the hazing followed predictable patterns, based on their known psychological vulnerabilities. Kitharians faced challenges to their energy manipulation abilities. Morvac endured isolation protocols that disrupted their collective consciousness, and Gorax got pounded on until they either fought back or developed the sort of trauma that made them useful as disposable troops. The system worked because it had been designed by experts who understood how to break down alien psychology and rebuild it according to military specifications. Jaxon presented a unique challenge because nobody really understood human psychology well enough to design an effective hazing program. The xenopsychology textbooks contained exactly 3 paragraphs about human behavior, most of which focused on their unusual pack-bonding tendencies and their species' alarming tendency to adopt dangerous predators as pets. This left his tormentors to improvise, which was unfortunate because improvisation required creativity, and creativity was dangerous when applied to breaking someone's spirit. The task of demolishing Jaxon's psychological defenses fell to a trio of upper-year cadets who'd volunteered for the assignment with the enthusiasm of artists approaching a blank canvas. Vexandra Kythe belonged to the sort of Kitharian nobility that traced their lineage back to the first fusion reactions in their homeworld's core, and she radiated the casual superiority that came from never encountering a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient application of electromagnetic force. Her plasma form shifted through the visible spectrum as her mood changed, and she approached tormenting Jaxon like a scientific experiment in primitive psychology. Her intellectual partner was Zefquiloxmore, a Morvac collective that had achieved individual consciousness while retaining access to their species' shared knowledge base. Where Vexandra provided aristocratic cruelty, Zefquilox supplied analytical precision. The collective had calculated exactly how much psychological pressure could be applied to a human without triggering the Institute's intervention protocols. And they approached the task with the methodical thoroughness that made their species invaluable as strategic planners. The muscle was provided by Grendak Voss, a Gorax who'd apparently been carved from particularly aggressive granite and given just enough intelligence to follow complex orders. Grendak didn't understand subtlety, psychology, or most concepts that required more than single-syllable explanations, but he grasped the fundamental principle of make the soft pink thing suffer with crystalline clarity. His approach to problem-solving involved systematic application of kinetic force until the problem either surrendered or stopped being identifiable as a problem. Together, they'd spent 4 months perfecting their technique on Jaxon, starting with minor harassment and escalating through increasingly creative forms of psychological warfare. They'd sabotaged his equipment, contaminated his food, rigged his sleeping quarters, with various unpleasant surprises, and subjected him to the sort of social isolation that had driven other cadets to transfer out within weeks. The human endured it all with the same blank expression he wore during lectures on interstellar law, showing no signs of the psychological breakdown his tormentors had been expecting. This lack of response frustrated the trio beyond measure. They'd broken dozens of other cadets using techniques that Jaxon seemed to shrug off like minor inconveniences. His stubborn refusal to crack suggested either extraordinary mental resilience or the sort of stupidity that prevented him from understanding when he was being humiliated. Either way, his continued existence at the Institute was becoming a personal insult to their abilities as psychological warfare specialists. What they didn't realize was that Jaxon was learning. Every attack taught him something new about his enemies. Vexandra's need for public acknowledgement of her superiority, Zefquilox's compulsion to overcomplicate simple solutions, Grendak's reliance on physical intimidation when intellectual approaches failed. He cataloged their patterns, their weaknesses, their psychological profiles with the methodical precision of a researcher conducting a long-term behavioral study. While they thought they were breaking him down, he was building detailed dossiers on each of his tormentors. The information Jaxon gathered painted a comprehensive picture of 3 individuals whose privileged backgrounds had left them unprepared for dealing with genuine adversity. Vexandra's aristocratic upbringing had convinced her that lesser beings existed primarily for her entertainment, while Zefquilox's collective consciousness had never learned to function as a truly independent entity. Grendak was simply a weapon pointed in whatever direction his superiors chose, lacking the imagination to consider that his targets might possess their own agenda. More importantly, Jaxon's background provided him with skills his tormentors couldn't have anticipated. His admission file listed him as a former agricultural worker from one of humanity's frontier colonies, someone whose greatest accomplishment had been operating heavy farming equipment without major injuries. What the file didn't mention was his 12 years of service with the Colonial Marine Corps, including advanced training in demolitions, psychological operations, and the sort of asymmetric warfare that turned technologically superior enemies into cautionary tales. The deception hadn't been difficult to maintain, because none of the Institute's faculty had bothered to verify human documentation. Humans were considered too primitive to pose any serious threat, and their species lacked the political influence necessary to make thorough background checks worthwhile. Jaxon's real military records were buried in databases that the Institute's researchers had never thought to access, hidden behind bureaucratic classifications that made them invisible to casual inquiry. The final escalation came during Advanced Combat Tactics, a course that combined live-fire exercises with strategic planning in environments designed to simulate actual battlefield conditions. Professor Krelvac, a veteran warrior whose species resembled an unholy fusion of mantis and tank, believed in learning through experience rather than theory. His exercises involved real weapons, genuine hazards, and casualty rates that would have appalled civilized educators but effectively separated competent officers from dead weight. The scenario that morning involved multi-species unit coordination during urban warfare operations. Cadets were assigned to mixed teams and tasked with capturing strategic objectives while avoiding civilian casualties and navigating environmental hazards scattered throughout the training facility. The weapons were configured for training intensity, which meant they'd cause severe injuries instead of instant death, and the environmental hazards included everything from automated defense systems to booby traps designed by sadistic engineers. Vexandra's team had drawn the role of defending force, tasked with holding key positions against attacking units led by other cadets. The assignment should have been straightforward, but Vexandra saw an opportunity to solve the Jaxon problem permanently while maintaining plausible deniability. The exercise's chaotic nature would provide perfect cover for an accident that removed the human embarrassment from their midst. The plan they developed was a masterpiece of malicious creativity. Zeph Quillock's calculated precise modifications to their defensive positions that would funnel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones, while Vexandra prepared to adjust her team's weapon settings from training to seriously maim. Grendak's role was simpler. Ensure that Jaxon's route through the training facility led him directly into every possible danger, with enough additional hazards to guarantee that any accident would prove fatal. The exercise began at dawn, with attacking teams advancing through the facility's lower levels while avoiding automated defenses and navigating obstacle courses designed to test their tactical awareness. Jaxon's team moved with the careful coordination of cadets who'd learned to trust each other's abilities, using hand signals and tactical awareness that impressed even their instructors. The human took point position, his movements displaying the sort of environmental awareness that came from growing up on worlds where inattention meant death. They cleared the first several objectives without major incident, which should have warned everyone involved that something was wrong. Professor Krelvac's exercises were notorious for their brutal difficulty, and this one felt suspiciously manageable for cadets who'd been struggling with basic tactical concepts just weeks earlier. But Jaxon seemed focused on mission parameters rather than potential complications, leading his team through challenges that tested their coordination and tactical thinking. The trap was waiting on the facility's fourth level, where Vexandra's defending team had prepared a reception that violated several conventions governing military training exercises. The objective, a communications array that needed to be captured and secured, stood at the center of a crossfire zone that offered no cover and multiple angles of attack. Standard doctrine called for the attacking team to find alternative approaches or call for supporting fire, but the exercise parameters required direct assault within specific time constraints. Jaxon studied the tactical situation with the sort of calm analysis that had kept him alive through campaigns against enemies considerably more dangerous than privileged alien cadets. He could see the trap, understand its purpose, and recognize that walking into it would likely result in serious injury or death. His teammates waited for his decision, trusting the human who'd somehow managed to guide them through challenges that had eliminated other units. What happened next would be analyzed in tactical journals and whispered about in cadet dormitories for decades afterward. Instead of calling for alternate routes or requesting support, Jaxon gave his team new orders: fall back to secure positions, and wait for his signal before advancing. He would proceed alone, draw the defenders' fire, and create an opening for the others to reach their objective. It was either an act of incredible heroism or tactical suicide, depending on your perspective on human decision-making processes. He advanced into the kill zone with measured steps, weapon ready but not aimed at any specific target. The defending team held their fire, waiting for him to commit fully to the trap before revealing their overwhelming advantage. Vexandra's plasma form flickered with anticipation as she prepared to demonstrate what happened to Deathworlders who thought they belonged among civilized species. The first shot came from Zefquilox's position, a precisely calculated blast designed to cripple rather than kill immediately. It struck Jaxon in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to one knee as blood began soaking through his training uniform. The second shot, fired by a Gorax cadet following Grendak's example, hit center mass with enough force to crack ribs and cause massive internal trauma. Jaxon collapsed forward, his weapon sliding across the floor as he struggled to maintain consciousness. His breathing became shallow and labored, the sort of respiratory distress that indicated critical injuries requiring immediate medical attention. The defending team maintained their positions, waiting to see if he would surrender or attempt to continue the exercise despite his obviously severe wounds. He did neither. Instead, Jaxon smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible from the defenders' positions, but his teammates, in their fallback positions, saw it clearly. They also saw him reach into his equipment pouch and activate what appeared to be a standard emergency beacon, the sort of device that would summon medical assistance and officially end the exercise. What they didn't see was the secondary signal it transmitted alongside the regulation distress call, or the response that signal triggered in systems scattered throughout the Institute. The explosion that followed wasn't part of the scheduled exercise. Multiple detonations erupted simultaneously across the training facility, each one carefully positioned to cause maximum disruption without threatening the structural integrity of the building itself. Emergency lighting activated, security doors sealed automatically, and evacuation protocols began broadcasting over the facility's communication network. The exercise came to an immediate halt as instructors and emergency response teams converged on the building to assess the damage and coordinate rescue operations. In the confusion that followed, Jaxon died from his injuries before medical teams could reach him. The official cause of death was listed as training exercise casualties complicated by facility malfunction, with a notation about possible equipment failure contributing to the severity of his wounds. The explosions were initially attributed to cascade failures in the building's power systems, possibly triggered by the stress of running multiple high-energy combat simulations simultaneously. An investigation was promised, evidence would be reviewed, and appropriate measures would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. The Institute's administration expressed deep regret for the loss of Cadet Kruger and assured his family that his sacrifice in service of military training would be remembered appropriately. They also quietly expedited the processing of his death benefits and arranged for his remains to be returned to human space with minimal bureaucratic delay. What they didn't mention was how quickly the investigation would be concluded, or how little effort would be devoted to determining why a routine training exercise had turned lethal. Jaxon was, after all, just a human from a minor species with limited political influence. His death was tragic but not particularly significant in the broader context of galactic military education. The 3 cadets responsible for the accident received disciplinary action for equipment violations, spent a week in detention for failing to follow proper safety protocols, and returned to their normal routines, with enhanced reputations for tactical innovation. Vexandra even received recognition for her creative approach to defensive positioning, though Professor Krelvac privately noted that creativity shouldn't extend to modifying weapon settings without proper authorization. Life at the Institute resumed its normal rhythm of classes, training, exercises, and the sort of institutionalized character building that prepared young aliens for careers in galactic military service. Jaxon Kruger became a cautionary tale about the dangers of admitting primitive species to advanced military institutions, and his death was filed away as another unfortunate example of what happened when Deathworlders tried to compete with their evolutionary superiors. For 3 days, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then Vexandra put on her ceremonial combat crown and nearly vaporized her own head. The crown was a work of art, crafted from rare energy crystals that complemented her plasma form's natural electromagnetic properties. She'd worn it dozens of times during formal ceremonies and combat demonstrations, and it interfaced with her energy patterns with the precision of a custom-designed weapon system. The crown enhanced her natural abilities while serving as a status symbol that announced her aristocratic heritage to anyone sophisticated enough to recognize true quality, which made it the perfect delivery system for a bomb specifically designed to exploit Kytherian physiology. The device was a masterpiece of miniaturization and lethality, integrated into the crown's energy regulation systems so perfectly that it appeared to be original equipment. It would have been triggered by Vexandra's unique electromagnetic signature, ensuring that only the intended target could activate the weapon. The explosive yield was calculated to overwhelm her energy form's defensive capabilities, while leaving enough physical evidence for proper forensic analysis. The only reason she survived was a routine equipment inspection that morning, part of enhanced safety protocols implemented following Jackson's death. Institute maintenance staff, suddenly paranoid about equipment malfunctions after the training facility incident, had decided to examine all cadet gear for potential problems. The inspection revealed the bomb during a standard power systems diagnostic, leading to the sort of emergency evacuation that made Institute administrators question their life choices. The bomb disposal team that examined the device expressed professional admiration for its construction while recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation for whoever had built it. The explosive was military-grade, sourced from materials available only in the Institute's most restricted laboratories. The triggering mechanism demonstrated intimate knowledge of Kytherian biology and the specific crown's technical specifications. The craftsmanship suggested someone with advanced training in both demolitions and xenobiology, combined with a disturbing understanding of psychological warfare principles. Vexandra's reaction to learning about her near-death experience was less professional and considerably more hysterical. She spent the next several hours alternating between demanding enhanced security and accusing random faculty members of attempting to murder her. Her aristocratic composure evaporated like plasma in a magnetic containment failure, revealing the sort of entitled terror that came from finally encountering a problem that couldn't be solved by radiating superiority at higher intensities. The Institute's response was swift and predictable: facility lockdown, security sweeps, and the sort of administrative panic that occurred whenever someone tried to kill a student whose family possessed enough political influence to cause serious diplomatic incidents. Director Morthane personally assured Vexandra's parents that the perpetrator would be identified and punished with the full severity of Institute discipline, possibly including public execution, if that would help maintain proper family relationships. Then they found the second bomb. Zefquilox discovered it during a routine diagnostic of their environmental pod, the life support system that allowed their collective consciousness to function in the Institute's terrestrial environment. The device was integrated into the pod's neural interface systems, designed to introduce a quantum virus specifically lethal to Morvac collective minds. Like the bomb in Vexandra's crown, it demonstrated intimate knowledge of both the target species and the specific equipment involved, suggesting a level of preparation that bordered on obsessive. The third bomb was located in Grendak's personal weapon cache, hidden within the power cells of his favorite warhammer. This device took a more direct approach, designed to overload the weapon's kinetic enhancement systems and turn it into an improvised explosive device. Given Grendak's tendency to grip his weapons with maximum force during combat, the explosion would have removed his hands, arms, and most of his torso in a spectacular display of kinetic energy redistribution. Each bomb demonstrated the same level of technical sophistication, the same intimate knowledge of alien biology, and the same access to restricted Institute materials. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was systematically targeting the 3 cadets responsible for Jaxon's death with weapons designed specifically for their species and personal equipment preferences. The bomber possessed both the technical skills and psychological insight necessary to create personalized assassination devices that would have impressed professional intelligence operatives. The Institute's investigation shifted into maximum paranoia mode, led by Investigator Prime Kelthax, a professional truth extractor whose species had evolved specifically for solving impossible mysteries through a combination of enhanced perception and legalized torture techniques. Kelthax's approach to investigation resembled a cross between advanced interrogation and psychological vivisection, and their reputation for extracting confessions was matched only by their reputation for leaving suspects requiring extensive psychiatric rehabilitation. The interrogations were conducted in isolation, with each suspect separated from the others to prevent coordination of their stories and maximize psychological pressure. Vexandra's session lasted 8 hours and left her plasma form flickering unstably as she confessed to every minor violation she'd ever committed, including several that weren't actually crimes. She admitted to systematically tormenting Jaxon, but maintained complete ignorance about who might want to kill her in return. Zefquilox's interrogation took a different approach, appealing to their collective intelligence and challenging them to solve the mystery of their own assassination attempt. The Morvax analytical mind couldn't resist the puzzle, and they spent hours calculating probabilities and constructing theories about potential suspects. Their conclusion: the bomber had to be someone with advanced technical knowledge, unrestricted access to Institute facilities, and intimate familiarity with all 3 targets' personal habits and psychological vulnerabilities. Grendak's interview was mercifully brief, consisting mainly of Kelthax asking questions in progressively smaller words until the Gorax admitted that thinking about complex problems made his head hurt. His contribution to the investigation was limited to confirming that he'd participated in making the human's life miserable, and that he couldn't imagine anyone else holding grudges about minor social interactions. The interrogations revealed the full scope of the harassment campaign that had targeted Jaxon, painting a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond the Institute's normal character-building traditions. The 3 cadets had coordinated their efforts over months, escalating from minor pranks to potentially lethal sabotage, while carefully avoiding the sort of obvious violence that would trigger official intervention. Their treatment of the human had violated numerous Institute regulations and several galactic conventions on the ethical treatment of sentient beings. What the interrogations didn't reveal was who had planted the bombs or how they'd gained access to such restricted materials and secured locations. Kelthax's investigation expanded to include the Institute's security systems, maintenance records, and personnel files for anyone with the necessary clearance levels and technical expertise. The bomber had demonstrated knowledge of the target schedules, access to their personal equipment, and the engineering skills necessary to create species-specific assassination devices. The suspect list should have been limited to a handful of advanced students and faculty members with appropriate security clearances. Instead, the investigation revealed a pattern of security anomalies that made Institute administrators question their entire personnel screening process. Access logs showed unauthorized entry to restricted laboratories during periods when those facilities should have been sealed and monitored. Equipment inventories revealed missing materials that hadn't been reported by the responsible departments, including military-grade explosives and specialized electronics components. Video surveillance systems had experienced systematic failures at precisely the times and locations where the bomber would have needed to work unobserved. The security breaches painted a picture of someone who understood the Institute's systems better than the security staff responsible for maintaining them. The bomber had moved through the facility like a ghost, avoiding detection while accessing the most restricted areas and acquiring the most dangerous materials available. Their knowledge of the target's personal habits and equipment preferences suggested months of careful observation and psychological profiling. As the investigation continued, Kelfax began to suspect they were dealing with an inside job orchestrated by someone with legitimate access to Institute facilities and detailed knowledge of their target's vulnerabilities. The bomber's intimate understanding of Catherian, Morvac, and Gorak's biology suggested advanced xenobiology training, while their technical skills indicated professional-level experience with military demolitions and psychological operations. The breakthrough came when maintenance crews discovered Jaxon's workshop, hidden in an abandoned section of the Institute's basement levels, concealed behind maintenance shafts and forgotten storage areas that hadn't appeared on facility maps for decades. Jaxon had constructed a command center that would have impressed professional intelligence operatives. The workshop contained detailed files on all 3 targets, including psychological profiles, daily schedules, equipment specifications, and biological data that painted a comprehensive picture of their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The files revealed the true scope of Jaxon's preparation. He'd spent months studying his tormentors with the methodical precision of a predator researching its prey, documenting every detail of their lives, and building psychological profiles that demonstrated professional-level understanding of alien behavior patterns. Every aspect of their personalities had been catalogued and analyzed. Vexandra's aristocratic arrogance and predictable need for public validation, Zeph Quilox's intellectual pride and compulsive need to demonstrate superiority, Grendak's simple brutality and limited capacity for complex reasoning. More disturbing were the technical schematics and manufacturing notes scattered throughout the workshop, evidence that Jaxon had designed and built the bombs himself. His research notes showed extensive study of Catherian energy form vulnerabilities, Morvac collective consciousness disruption techniques, and Gorak's structural weak points. He'd approached the task of creating species-specific assassination devices like an academic research project, complete with peer-reviewed sources and experimental testing protocols. The workshop also contained evidence of Jaxon's true background, information that had been carefully omitted from his Institute admission file. Military service records from the Colonial Marine Corps showed extensive combat experience in asymmetric warfare operations, specialized training in demolitions and psychological operations, and commendations for tactical innovation in hostile environments. Letters from former commanding officers described him as exceptionally capable and dangerously creative when dealing with superior enemy forces. The deception had been masterful in its simplicity. Jaxon had presented himself as a simple farm worker from a frontier colony, someone whose greatest accomplishment had been operating agricultural machinery without major accidents. The Institute's admission committee had never bothered to verify human documentation beyond basic identity confirmation, assuming that primitive species lacked both the sophistication to falsify records and the political influence to make thorough background checks worthwhile. But the most chilling discovery was Jaxon's contingency planning system. Hidden within the workshop's computer systems, investigators found detailed protocols for posthumous activation of his revenge campaign. Jaxon had anticipated his own death and created automated systems designed to continue his mission without direct supervision. The bombs had been planted weeks before the fatal training exercise, programmed to arm themselves only after his biological signals ceased transmitting for more than 72 hours. The Dead Man Switch was a masterpiece of paranoid preparation, incorporating multiple redundant systems that monitored Jaxon's vital signs through sensors embedded in his Institute uniform and personal equipment. If those signals disappeared for the specified duration, the workshop's automated systems would execute their programmed instructions. Arm the bombs, activate backup protocols, and begin destroying evidence according to carefully planned schedules designed to maximize confusion while minimizing the risk of discovery. Jaxon had died knowing that his tormentors would face consequences for their actions, even if he couldn't survive to witness their punishment personally. His final message, recorded for Institute administration and triggered by the same systems that armed the bombs, was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone briefing superior officers on completed mission objectives. By the time you access this recording, his voice announced through the workshop speakers, "I'll be dead, and you'll be dealing with the consequences of institutional failure to address systematic harassment of cadets. The devices you've discovered represent only the opening phase of this operation. I've had months to prepare for this contingency, and I've used that time efficiently." The message continued for several minutes, detailing the harassment he'd endured and the Institute's consistent failure to address it through official channels. His tone remained matter-of-fact as he described the reasoning behind his posthumous revenge campaign, explaining how he'd given the Institute multiple opportunities to intervene before his death and how their institutional indifference had triggered the consequences they were now experiencing. "You wanted to understand what humans are capable of when subjected to systematic abuse," the recording concluded. "Consider this your comprehensive education in Deathworlder psychology and tactical planning capabilities. We don't just survive hostile environments, we adapt to them and turn them against our enemies." The investigation revealed additional layers of Jaxon's preparation as it continued. His contingency systems included backup devices in case the primary bombs were discovered, alternative targeting protocols if his original tormentors were somehow protected, and escalating response plans if the Institute attempted to cover up his death or minimize the significance of his message. He'd anticipated multiple scenarios and prepared appropriate responses for each possibility. Institute officials found themselves dealing with a posthumous adversary who'd systematically outmaneuvered their security systems and demonstrated tactical capabilities that their xenobiology experts hadn't thought possible in primitive species. Jaxon's revenge operation was more sophisticated than most military campaigns, executed with precision that earned grudging respect even from his intended victims. The bombs were eventually defused by specialist teams brought in from galactic military commands, but the psychological damage had already been inflicted. Vexandra developed severe paranoia and transferred to a different institution on a world with higher security standards and lower academic expectations. Zefkilox became obsessed with analyzing the technical aspects of Jaxon's plan, eventually publishing research papers on human psychological warfare capabilities that became required reading in military psychology courses. Grendak simply requested assignment to duties that didn't require thinking about complex problems or dealing with species that might hold grudges. The Institute's administration faced uncomfortable questions about their enrollment procedures, security protocols, and institutional culture that had enabled the sort of systematic abuse leading to Jaxon's death. The Galactic Council's investigation revealed fundamental failures in oversight and an educational environment that had prioritized traditional hazing practices over student welfare. Several faculty members faced disciplinary action for their failure to recognize or respond appropriately to the escalating harassment campaign. More significantly, the incident forced a complete reassessment of human capabilities and psychology across galactic civilization. Previous evaluations had focused on their species' physical resilience and environmental adaptability. But Jaxon's posthumous campaign demonstrated intellectual and tactical abilities that required serious reconsideration by xenopsychology experts and military planners throughout the galaxy. The Institute established new protocols for investigating harassment complaints, implemented enhanced security measures for student equipment and facilities, and created mandatory courses on interspecies relations and conflict resolution. They also quietly established a memorial scholarship in Jaxon's name, though they were careful to avoid publicizing the circumstances that had led to its creation. Years later, when Institute graduates shared war stories and cautionary tales about their educational experiences, Jaxon Kruger's name was always mentioned with a mixture of professional respect and existential terror. His story became a standard case study in the dangers of underestimating supposedly primitive species and the consequences of institutional failure to address systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The final assessment, noted by investigator Prime Kelfax in their confidential report, carried implications that extended far beyond the Institute itself. A military academy designed to train the galaxy's finest officers had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by a single human cadet they'd dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. Jaxon had demonstrated exactly the sort of strategic thinking and tactical innovation that the institution claimed to foster, except he'd used those skills to destroy the institution's credibility and force fundamental changes in their operational procedures. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about Deathworlders. They didn't just survive hostile environments through physical resilience alone. They adapted psychologically, developing the sort of long-term strategic thinking and tactical patience that turned apparent weakness into devastating advantage. When those environments included systematic institutional abuse and administrative indifference, they adapted in ways that would give their enemies nightmares for generations. Professor Krelvac, in his final evaluation of the incident, observed that Jaxon had achieved something unprecedented in Institute history. He'd forced fundamental institutional reform through a single, perfectly executed psychological warfare operation. His posthumous tactical victory was studied in advanced strategy courses as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare and the critical importance of understanding your opponent's true capabilities before engaging in hostile action. The Institute's unofficial motto, adopted quietly after the incident, reflected the hard-learned lesson about human psychology. Never underestimate the quiet ones. It was a principle that served them well in future interactions with species they didn't fully understand, particularly those from worlds that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of survival against impossible odds. In the end, Jaxon Kruger had achieved exactly what he'd planned: respect for his species, consequences for his tormentors, and fundamental changes that would protect future students from similar abuse. The fact that he'd had to die to accomplish these goals was probably the sort of ironic outcome that would have satisfied his sense of tactical completeness, assuming he'd possessed the luxury of appreciating irony from beyond the grave. The galaxy became a more cautious place after learning about human psychological warfare capabilities. And somewhere in the cosmic balance sheet of justice, a dead Deathworlder's spirit was probably enjoying the beautiful chaos he'd created using nothing more than patience, intelligence, and the sort of vindictive creativity that only developed on worlds where everything was actively trying to kill you. The Nexarion Defense Institute learned to treat their human cadets with considerably more respect after that educational experience. Some lessons, after all, were too expensive to learn twice, and the cost of underestimating Deathworlder psychology had proved higher than anyone had anticipated.